All right. Hey, folks. So we're back for the How I Gained 20 Pounds of Muscle in my first year of training video series. Been very popular recently, so going to head on with that. The goal behind this series is to give you guys an insight into what I actually did in my first year of proper training to gain 20 pounds of muscle. And I'm going to carry on analyzing the ins and outs of everything I did with the hindsight of 25 years of experience, looking back at a young me trying to make those gains, similar to what a lot of you guys are doing. So hopefully you guys will get some benefit from this. And it's definitely one of those video series which highlights reality. What did I actually do? Not what do I think might work or what do I recommend? Actually, here's what I did, which I think is a refreshing breath of air in the YouTube space. So today's video is going to be about exercise choices and rotations. Now, in the beginning, I just had one rotation and I just hit those exercises, those about 5 exercises just over and over again, which were the bench press, the chin, the seated press, the squat, and the full deadlift. In the beginning, I did all of those lifts and I just hit them over and over again, training about 3 times per week. Now, my choice of exercises reflected my goals. My stance was, if I trained hard, ate my food, recovered, and was obsessive about putting weight on the bar for medium to high rep ranges with good form, I would get bigger and stronger. That was my main obsession in those early years. So my exercise choice reflected that, because I thought to myself, if I want big legs, I want to get that squat up to the point where I'm able to handle 3.5, 4 plates aside for a good set. And then I'm going to be as big and strong as I want to be. And that was the goal. That was really the thought process in his early years. Now, the method behind that was a little more complicated, and that's what this series is explaining. But the basic goal was very simple. Now, you might argue with the goal. You might argue and say it's not the most efficient way to go about training for size. Perhaps you should do more volume, or perhaps you should cycle poundages or do deloads and all that kind of stuff. And I'm going to say, I agree with you. I agree. I agree that right now, my approach is a lot more nuanced and is a lot more specific to my current goal of gaining and retaining size. So I agree with you, but I did have one thing which I think quite a lot of you lack, and that was a simple goal. There's a lot to be said for simplicity and the dogged determination after one specific goal. It's a confusing space out there. I think you guys will agree. YouTube is a pretty confusing space. One guy will say one thing, the other guy will say something completely, seemingly the opposite, even though they're both talking about the same goal. So simplicity is very important. And this brings us back to the discussion about poundage goals, which have come under fire recently. The targets of a 3-plate bench, 4-plate squat, 5-plate deadlift, numerous well-meaning but somewhat naive YouTubers saying, actually, you're never going to reach 3 plates aside on the bench. I don't think that's a sensible message to the masses. What I actually believe is those simple goals, while they do have their flaws, poundage targets are actually a very useful thing. Now, for me, in the beginning, they set me on a very clear path to getting jacked. Was my squat going up? No, I had to fix it. If my squat wasn't going up, I didn't really have any other options. I couldn't just switch it out, do a different routine, because that was my goal. It kept me on track. It kept me, to use my own phrase that I use a lot, it kept me in the golden zone. So I agree that there are problems with poundage targets, but I think what they do provide is simplicity and a route forward. In the beginning, I chose those 5 lifts because those formed part of my goal. And I thought, if I got reasonably strong for medium to high rep ranges with good form in those 5 lifts, I would be strong and jacked. And I was proving that method to myself, because as I got stronger and stronger, I was rapidly seeing progress. In 20 pounds of muscle, it was a total of 40 pounds of weight gain in that first year. 20 pounds of muscle is noticeable. In those early months, I was proving that to myself by continuously getting bigger and stronger. The method worked. So in the beginning, I had those 5 lifts. Now, As I got stronger and stronger throughout the course of the year, I added more lifts. Now, what was the criteria for adding these lifts? Initially, the criteria was, are they loadable and are they safe? Those are the main things. I thought to myself, and this is something which I discuss with my clients when we're looking at making a strong push up in the off season. If they select an exercise which is new to them, but they want to do, the question is always, can you see yourself doing this exercise with this form with an additional 50 kilos at some point? So the initial criteria for choosing the lifts was this: can I do this exercise safely? And is it loadable in the long term? And I was thinking an extra 50 kilos, an extra 100 kilos. That was my criteria. So if I was benching 70 kilos, 60 kilos, could I do this with this form with an additional 50 kilos on the bar eventually when I've built myself up enough? Or was there something about the lift which is unsafe? For example, guys would sometimes take a very wide grip on the bench, which can beat up the shoulders. Is that something I want to engage in? Because if it's going nowhere, then why would I start with that form? It's a bit like a relationship. If you're starting a relationship with someone and you don't really see a future with that person, is it worth pursuing? If you're looking for a long-term relationship, not just a short-term fling, I would argue probably not, because you're probably wasting your own time. And in this case, you're probably wasting their time too. But in the case of exercise selection, why would I persist with a form which didn't feel right to me? Why would I persist with an exercise which I didn't really feel suited to? So in those early years, I did try things like front squats. Didn't work for me. I just always felt unstable with the bar across my shoulder. I didn't have great flexibility. I had a wrist operation when I was a kid, which meant my flexibility in my left wrist was limited. So front squats were never going to be on my radar of effective exercises. So I tried them, I dropped them. They felt okay with 80 to 100 kilos, but could I see myself doing that with 150, 160, 200 kilos? No. Eventually, I did go on to front squat 170 kilos, but that was many years later. And it was more of a party trick for me than it was an actual training exercise. But anyway, in those early years, my main concern was I need to find a series of exercises which feel safe and are loadable in the long term. That was my criteria. And that really was the basis for me choosing those lifts initially. The squat, the full deadlift, the bench press, the weighted chin, and the seated barbell press. They all felt safe and they all felt loadable. My weighted chin was underhand, shoulder width. Overhand, wider than shoulder, just didn't feel very good. I can do them now, but in the early stages, it didn't feel very good. So it didn't matter that I saw Sean Ray or Flex Wheeler doing wide grip pull-ups. It didn't matter that those guys were saying in the magazines, this is good for your lats, this builds a great back. It didn't matter because those didn't feel good for me. So I didn't persist in any exercise unless it was, say it with me, safe and loadable in the long term. So that was my initial criteria. And I molded the routine around those 5 lifts, just an upper and lower, training about 3 times a week. Eventually, what I did was I added in a second rotation. So the next part is when to add in the second rotation. When do I go from upper, lower to upper 1, lower 1, upper 2, lower 2? When did that transition happen? I think people do that far too soon. I think people look for variety. In my beginner programs for my beginner clients, if they are doing an upper, lower, or whatever, typically they're doing the same rotation over and over again, twice a week, because they can progress faster doing that. And they do, because it's more practice, quicker progress. You're more able to progress on a lift if you can recover from it by training it every 3.5 to 5 days rather than every 7 days, or in this case, every 10 days. So I think a mistake that people make is they look for complexity because they've just heard that's the way to do it. And it's the same with exercise selection. Some guy might insist on doing wide grip pull-ups because his favorite influencer said it works for them. Now, listen, they're a great exercise for lats, but if they don't fit you, it's not going to matter. And especially in those early stages when you don't have much muscle mass, you have to be very careful about the exercise that suit you. Now I'm bigger and I'm more thickly muscled. Pretty much any exercise fits me. I can make any exercise work. Okay. There are no exercises that I don't like doing now. But in the early stages, when you don't have a lot of muscle, you really have to be very careful about the lifts that you do because some of them just won't feel very good. You need more muscle to make things work better. Like I never benched with more than a shoulder width bench. So effectively, all of my benches up to about my first 3-plate bench were close grip. It was only as I got bigger and bigger did I start to widen my grip out because then it felt safe on the shoulders. There were plenty of people telling me, look, I'm holding back my progress. I should be doing wide grip bench. But why would I listen? It didn't feel safe. Could I see myself doing it with an extra 50 kilos eventually? At the time, I couldn't. So it didn't matter. And in the same way, when it comes to rotations, people just think, okay, this is the way it is. If I'm doing an upper lower, I've got to start with 2 rotations. Well, no, because if you're only benching 60 kilos, you can do that twice a week. It's easy to recover from that. In fact, you should be. It'll give you more progress. It'll give you more gains. So initially, I think people default to rotations too soon because they've just heard that's the way it should be when it's not. Okay. Now, eventually I did add in a second rotation. So the question is, when did I add in a second rotation? My advice to you is this. When you've done squats on the Monday and you're due to do squats again, say Friday, because you're doing upper lower 3 days a week, right? When the thought of doing squats again makes you absolutely sick to your stomach, that's when you should probably switch. That's a good indicator. And that's what I did. When the thought of doing squats just again with maximal weight for what were really difficult, tough, painful reps, when the thought of that made me sick, I thought it's time to switch and I added in another rotation. Now, there is a caveat with that. You can't be a pussy, right? So if you're switching and you're squatting 80 kilos, you need to get your priorities right. More than likely, your food is off, your rest and recovery is off, or you're just a wuss. So I'm trusting you to do that at the time it's necessary and not before. But that's what I did. Okay, my food was taken care of. I was young and I really wanted this. So I knew I would get better progress by squatting over again. When I did eventually add in a second rotation, it was not an easy choice for me because I knew it would slow down progress because then I would be doing each lift every 10 days rather than every 5 days. Do you see what I mean? Adding in rotations for me was mentally a step backwards because I was doing the lift less frequently. For a lot of guys, they think it's just a way to go. Let's add in more complexity because they're more interested in complexity and program design than they are in actually getting bigger and stronger. It's similar to the video I made recently. People are more interested in appearing to be clever than actually getting jacked, which is a damn shame. So eventually I added in a second set of exercises. So here's what I did. Every additional lift had to complement the original lift. So squats, the perfect adjunct to squats for me as a long limb lifter was leg presses. Perfect. Front squats weren't really an option for me because it didn't really work so well. And at the time, high bar, close stance, Olympic style squats, they felt terrible on my knees. My knees were bomb-proof back in the day, but high bar, close stance squats felt terrible. So it wasn't an option. Again, what's the criteria for a good lift? Does it feel safe and is it loadable? So I chose leg presses and they worked tremendously well. It filled in exactly what I needed from the exercise. It gave me more quads to support the squat. So as the leg press went up, the squat went up and vice versa. It was a tremendous combination. For the deadlift, I chose the rack pull. Now at the time I was doing sumo deadlifts for competition, but also they felt good. That was the form which felt loadable and safe. So I thought what would be a good idea as an adjunct to sumo deadlifts was conventional stance rack pulls. So just below the knee, rack pulls worked beautifully. Sumo and conventional are like salt and pepper. They complement each other extremely well. So that was the goal, to pick lifts which complement each other very well. Now I see in the programs of a lot of lifters, because of this bias against sumo, I see a lot of people don't take advantage of sumo deadlifting, but they still insist on doing a lot of adductor work on the good girl, bad girl, which I think is quite silly, to be honest. I think it's people just choosing the easy option. But if you're a young, relatively weak lifter, there's no real need for you to pick those types of isolation lifts, those two lifts, the sumo and the conventional, they complement each other extremely well. Because typically speaking, the areas which aren't worked as heavily in one lift will be worked heavily in the other lift. For example, the sumo deadlift targets the glutes and the adductors a lot more than a conventional, a lot more. Whereas the conventional deadlift is a lot more lower back, which is great. So you have two very complementary lifts, which are basically similar because they're just both variations of the deadlift. All jokes aside, initially the whole sumo thing started off as a joke. People, and it is a joke, it's funny, but the joke shouldn't be taken so seriously that you actually harm your progress. It's still a good lift. It serves a purpose. And the majority of you doing various variations of conventional deadlifts, like conventionals, rack pulls, deficit pulls, stiff leg deadlifts, a lot of you guys would be better off just implementing a sumo variation. The next up was bench press. Now, the best complement to the bench press that I found was the weighted dip. In fact, for a short period of time in that year, I think for about a couple of months, I exclusively did the weighted dip. And I came back to the bench and my bench had improved. So it was a very good lift for me. The weighted dip is touted as the upper body squat. And that's why I chose it, because it was such a classic lift. The weighted dip is a superb lift for all over upper body gains. It complemented the bench extremely well. And at the time, I wasn't a particularly great bencher. So the dip was a good lift for me because I was good at dipping. Very good. Next was the weighted chin. The natural choice for that was bent over rows. So I was just doing bent over rows, classic Dorian Yates style. Now with the seated press, I ended up doing a seated dumbbell press, which was fine. But the point is this. When I added in a second rotation, I did it out of necessity, not out of choice. I did it because I just could not stomach doing the same lift over and over again because I physically couldn't do it. And also the lifts that I introduced complemented the original lifts, so they would both go up. Think of it as an orchestra. Everything helps each other to support the main goal. Okay. And also notice all of these exercises are basic compounds. I didn't do any isolation work aside from some arm work when I decided to do arm work, but weighted chins and dips work your arms. You've seen the arms on gymnasts, they're massive. So I didn't have a problem with bicep and tricep size in my early year. In fact, my guns were pretty good actually. So my focus was on getting a bigger, stronger body overall. There was no focus on isolations, which I just didn't find as effective because, again, they didn't feel good to me and they weren't loadable. In those early years when I didn't have much muscle, like I was saying, you have to be very careful about the exercises you choose. You have to find ones which feel good, and generally they're going to be compounds. So isolations are fine. I do some isolations now, but even now I get more bang for my buck just from biasing compounds to a certain area. So it was not part of my journey in that initial first year. And for a lot of you, that's something to bear in mind. I see people nowadays doing like single arm work for the chest when they can barely bench 80 kilos, which I think is madness. So those are things that I've prioritized. I also did not prioritize adding volume or trying to reach an arbitrary volume total. Those were not things I did until much later, closer to my third and fourth year of training. The goal was strength progression because, again, my basic goal was get bigger and stronger on the basic lifts. Good things will happen. And I was proving that to myself month after month by getting bigger and stronger. By the end of that first year, I looked very much like I lifted. I'm pretty sure I was the biggest 18-year-old in my city that I lived in. Now, later on, I needed to add extra volume, but that was to drive more strength. And that's the story, I think, for another day. So I'm going to call this here. Some of the main lessons that I want you guys to take away from this are initially and always try to use the least amount of variation possible. Variation is not inherently a good thing. It's inherently going to dilute your progress. Secondly, when you do add variation, try to make it support the rest of the lifts for that body part. Think of them as an orchestra for that body part, all pushing everything forward together. And also, I would say exercises should be chosen based on how they feel. Do they feel safe? Do they feel loadable? I think a lot of people choose exercises based on how they feel on the muscle. Do I get a burn? Do I feel my pecs engage? That was never a concern of mine. Do they feel safe? Do they feel loadable? That's there's a lot more long-term momentum there. Because if you do dumbbell flies and they feel great, how much are you going to be able to load those? Whereas an incline bench, a bench press, a particular chest machine you like, you can load that. There's a lot more potential there for growth. I think people lose sight of that fact. Okay, folks, I'm going to call it there. Hopefully this was useful and interesting, some lessons for you, and I'll see you in the next one. All right, take care.